This is House Planning Help episode 271. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up, it's a solo session as I look at the most commonly asked questions about the Passivhaus standard. And the reason for this is actually because I've just been to an event at the National Self-Build and Renovation Centre, and so it's fresh in my mind. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. First, Uri Mikurchik. I have a feeling he's going to get mentioned 3 times in today's podcast, and you'll find out why shortly. But this first mention is because I have finally been to his Passivhaus build. It's built with those straw panels as well, the Con, the one. It's one of those names that I can never get my mouth around, but I think I've given it a good go there. So I went to check out his self-build, Old Holloway, and it's lovely. You know, it constantly surprises me how you can see photos, go to presentations and know exactly what it's going to look like. But when you go there, it just feels slightly different for whatever reason. It's a very crisp piece of architecture, all on quite a low budget. And what he's done with that budget is very, very smart. So I thoroughly enjoyed having a look around, particularly because it's built with these straw panels. I think there's just an extra little feeling that you get. So you've got a passive house with those straw panels, with the natural materials, and it's a sort of extra warm feeling on top of the standard passive house, standard comfort. Check out his blog if you haven't already. Of course, we'll put a link in today's show notes. So, setting the scene for today's podcast, I've been part of this event before, but it's great to be back down at the National Self-Build and Renovation Centre for their Passivhaus workshops in association with the Passivhaus Trust. And this is an event, it's 2 workshops, it's the same thing each day. Well, slight tweak on the lineup, but more or less the same content over 2 days so you can get along. And we had a really good turnout. You always find that this crowd, they're very well educated, and that's why I thought that this is an interesting one to do today, because at these events, one of the sessions about halfway through the day is a Passivhaus Q&A. So not only probably do they know a lot before they even turn up, then they watch a number of different seminars and they sit through them all. And it's not like they think, oh, I've had 2 hours of that. That's quite enough. I'm going home now. They generally stay for the entire day and get everything they possibly can out of it, which is very wise, of course. So this Q&A, the last time round I was involved in the Q&A, but this time I got to just sit and I thought, well, while I'm here, let's take a few notes. And it's always interesting because I've done the Passivhaus open days recently where I've opened my own house and you get questions as you go around. And I think those questions are starting to change a little bit. No longer do you get, can you open the windows in a Passivhaus? It's almost a distant memory. Was it ever real that people were asking that? Well, they don't seem to ask that sort of thing. What do they ask? Well, that's what we're going to find out. Before we get to that point, let me tell you some of the people on the panel. It was different each day, but these are all the people added together here. So Alan Budden from Eco Design Consultants, Jay Cottrell and Anna Carton from Passivhaus Homes, Paul Smith from Green Building Store, Jasper Mead from PYC Installation, Robin Miller from Beco Wallform, Clarissa Uden and Michael Hunt from Total Home Environment, and self-builder Uri Mikurchik. That's his second mention on the podcast. There'll be one more coming. And the Q&A was chaired by Chris Herring. So he first asked the panel a question of his own, which I think is worth repeating here. And that was, what would be their top tip if they could dispense one piece of advice about going to build a passive house? What would it be? So in no particular order, put Passivhaus on the brief from day one. I bumped into someone at this event who came up to me saying, I think I've done it all wrong. He was going for planning. And yeah, it was one of those moments where you just don't know what to say, that he really liked Passivhaus, but for whatever reason didn't come across this information until now. And he thought he was coming to this event to pick a heating system when in actual fact, no, he liked the idea of this. So I have no idea whether he decided to go back because he was just at that planning stage where it's a little bit difficult when you've designed the house at that stage, you need to step backwards, and I can totally understand why you wouldn't want to do that. But yes, it's always what we want to do. That's what these sorts of events are for. Ideally, trying to catch people who have just started having a look around. But that's definitely one advantage if you're on this path of not being able to find land and you've just got time on your hands, that hopefully it'd be very difficult to walk past and not notice the Passive House standard, unless that's just what you don't want. So put it on the brief on day one. Take a fabric first approach. And by this, we're meaning invest your money in the fabric, in achieving Passive House standard before you even start thinking of the renewables. Don't go, oh, I tell you what, I've always wanted this huge, great solar array. Do that at the end. So get this bit done first and make sure that you can have a high performance home. Get buy-in from all of your team is another very good one. Make sure you hire someone with Passive House experience. Definitely seems to be the case that if they've done a few before, they're in a nice position. Don't skip steps like missing out the PHPP modeling. Chris actually showed a really good slide in his presentation earlier on about what if you build a passive house, but you want to leave out certain elements. You don't want the windows or whatever, and just it's going to be drafty, or you don't want to go for the air tightness, or actually you're not bothered about the insulation. It's a whole approach, so don't do bits of it. Doesn't work. Get the form factor down. This will have good impact on the project. Similarly, keep it simple is another piece of advice. It's going to be easier. It's going to be cheaper as well. And we'll do one more: design out the overheating risk. So this is something that is specified in Passive House. It's at 10% at the moment, which could well come down, I would think, in future years. But you imagine 10% of the time being over 25 degrees. I think most people want to just design that out because you can, particularly if you get someone who knows what they're doing. So we're going to stick on the subject of heat for a moment for our first question. This is still, again, well, I think this is a really good question, particularly because the panel didn't have a clear answer on this, and that is, how do you heat a passive house? Before I answer that, the other question that can come along, and did in this session as well, was, I've heard that you don't really need to heat a passive house. Is that true? So that's the bit that certainly where we are in the world, you will need a bit of extra heat. But how you get that heat, that was up for discussion on the panel. So if you're going down a renewables approach, air source heat pump can work quite well. I've seen that on a few passive houses. Again, it has to be designed well. Make sure it is, and don't cut any corners there either. Ground source heat pump, this is not such a good solution for passive house generally because it's overkill. So you don't see too many passive houses using that, and that's a similar thing, underfloor heating. It doesn't really work nicely. It doesn't play nicely with passive house because sun comes out and you want to throttle everything back, and because you've got all those loops in your floor, it doesn't work so well. But it is funny, on the tours you get that quite often. So have you got underfloor heating here? And they just instinctively think, oh, it's so comfy, you must have underfloor heating. Now, this is where I suppose we go off-piste a little bit. I'll tell you what, I'll talk about my gas boiler, because that might have been an old-fashioned solution that perhaps you think, yeah, put gas in because you're only going to use a very small amount of gas. And my logic as well, why I did it, was I was thinking, well, have a connection because maybe some other gas might come along in the future. And what I don't want to have to do is dig up the driveway out to the main road when actually that could have been done at this time. And then we can go the other way around of disconnecting and getting set up with an air source heat pump or whatever other solution we would want. But yes, mentioning Jasper Mead, for example, he was saying that he built a passive house office, and what they decided to do, which I think is so interesting, is they didn't put heating in, but they wanted to just see what would happen in that first couple of years. What's it like if you don't have any heating, knowing that you can do something afterwards. And how they work it now is they've got a couple of electric heaters downstairs, and that works that it just heats up the whole building because, yeah, the air gets moved around, doesn't it? Heat rises, all the rest of it, and it all evens out nicely. And no doubt being an office, I think with lots of people in, it quickly warms up, gets up to temperature. So that's interesting. Also in the UK, the grid has often been, you don't want electric because of the grid, but as that decarbonises, that's not so much of an issue now. The other thing Alan Budden was talking about was similarly to this, but electric panel heaters, that they're quite a good solution. Again, the same sort of idea as Jasper there, but you can move them around easily to where you want them, and actually you start heating up the whole house quite quickly. So yeah, they weren't agreed there. This also linked in a little bit with heating your home. What do you think about having a wood-burning stove in a passive house? You definitely get this a lot. If you've been following my story for a while, you might remember back in the day when my wife was, oh yes, we need a wood-burning stove in the new house. And what we did was we managed to compromise a little bit, although I think I won this. I'm going to say that we've got this about a £500 bioethanol burner. So we've been in the house a year. Just take my voice down a bit here. And we haven't touched it. But at least it was only £500. We could probably put it back up on eBay at some point, but we haven't had to make any holes through the fabric or whatever. But it's just that attachment. Everyone wants that attachment to the fire. And we're lucky in this village where we live because we're in between two pubs and they have a lovely roaring fire. So if you're really after that, oh, I need to get back to a fire, I'm feeling so cold, which you never get in a passive house anyway. One of the strange things is you look outside and say, what is the weather doing today? You look at it, you think, is that cold or is that mild? It's hard to tell in here. If you do want to go down the wood-burning stove, yes, it can be done. We've seen a few examples. Oh, is he going to get 4 mentions now? You're right, Mikurchik, his house has a wood-burning stove in, but there's probably quite a good reason that he's in a very rural area and has access to his own timber supply. So there is something. But I would say, and we chatted to Kate de Selencourt about this, that the health impact, even of those stoves that are sealed most of the time, you open the door and particulates will come out, and that's not good for health. And obviously, if it's an open fire, it's even worse, but you wouldn't have one of those in a passive house. So I think it's all doable. It can be done. We had Danny Luder Thompson as well. His house had a stove in, and you might want to flick back to that podcast if you haven't heard that one, just to hear him talking about it and trying to make it happen. But I think one of the key things is about making sure it's got its own air supply. So if you want one, not impossible, you can put it in your house, but see if you can go without. If you're on that fence position where you're thinking, do we, don't we? You probably don't need it. Is thermal mass important in a passive house? Now, I think the answer to this is not in the massive way of, you need to get as much thermal mass in the house as you possibly need, because passive house isn't quite like that. Yes, it's a good idea to have some thermal storage capacity, but you don't need a lot, and it's often just to smooth out the edges. If you've got a concrete slab. I know Jay Cottrell from PH15, the timber frame system, she was even telling me about how the insulation, which is a cellulose insulation, it's so dense that it actually becomes a bit of thermal mass. So yes, you should have some, and it's going to even everything out, but it's not about everything, we have to go concrete, we have to go, any masonry blocks, we have to really build it up. You probably don't need as much as you think you do. What is the value of certification? So if you're building to Passive House standard, then certification is part of the process, really to catch things going wrong. I think it's quality assurance. We've got an episode with Andrew Peel that we'll link into the show notes. We've got numerous others. We chatted to Peter Warm as well about what do you get for certification. I suppose you could say that if a company, let's say I were to hire Archetype, who build loads of passive house buildings, they would probably deliver me a passive house, whether it was certified or not, because they know what they're doing. They've done it so many times before, and they know the bits that are important. So I think any architecture firm, anyone who's managing it well, can deliver you a passive house. But you've got to look at this another way, that even if you are with someone like that, what happens when you come to sell your property? If you're looking for a passive house, are you not going to want to buy a certified property? So you could say, well, collect all the evidence that you're going to need along the way and then do it at a later date. That's quite a good idea. But there is a reason for certification. And I don't know what the stats are on this, but certainly there's a difference between those who embark on, we'll follow Passive House principles, and those who decide to build to Passive House standard. If you put those side by side, sometimes there can be big differences. This is all about the performance gap a well-known flaw in the construction world. So the whole certification process is trying to catch that. So we'll put some extra links in if you want more reading on that. A few more questions. This one came up in this particular form, but it's really a retrofit question. Can you make a Victorian house into a passive house? And the answer here is yes, it's entirely possible. In fact, I remember doing this was one of my very early podcasts when I spoke to Tom Pakenham about his retrofit Lena Gardens, and I thought it was amazing and that everything would end up being like that. Everything could be retrofitted, but you're sort of working against the grain of these old buildings. It's not saying don't do it, but there are lots of things you've got to be very careful about. Moisture as well. You don't want to trap any moisture, and it's actually not that easy unless you strip everything right back. You've got the Passive House retrofit standard, which is Enefit, which is slightly less stringent, so can allow you to meet that. But even, we're mentioning that this panel was chaired by Chris Herring from Green Building Store, and we had that recent podcast with the other director, Bill Butcher, about two of their retrofit projects, and they didn't even go for Enefit. It's trying to say how high up there it is there and how demanding it is that on some of their buildings, even Enefit was tough to reach. So I'll put those into the show notes. It's not saying that it's impossible. We've had other podcasts as well, haven't we? We've had one on the Reach Guest House recently. We'll put links to that. Harry Patikas on his phased retrofit, and that's award-winning, so he's done really well there. So yes, it's possible. The other thing that we should mention is actually retrofit is one of those things that we really need to get to grips with, and that when you make improvements to a house, you're locking them in really for the next few years, because if you've made some major alterations to your house, you're probably not going to be doing it again for some time. So definitely a good upgrade to your house is important. We've got a plot. What are the first steps to designing a passive house? Well, I think we've mentioned one of them, and that's put it on your brief really on day one. Go out in search of professionals. Are they, or do they have in their team a certified passive house designer? Again, I think experience counts for a lot. So if they've been through it before and can show you, look, I've designed lots of certified passive houses before. The Passive House Trust itself, the website's very good. It's got all sorts of guidance on there. The open days, again, I was chatting to one of our hub members, Mary was down there. We sat down and had a little chat, and she was mentioning that the last few open days, she's been, for example, to all of the Green Building Store properties on the last run of open days. And that's the thing, that you can take advantage of these, and just maybe if it's something in your area, you could find out, how did you get this built? What tips would you have? And it will all be useful, localized information. So that's that one. Does the Passive House standard take you down a timber frame route? So it obviously doesn't discriminate. You can achieve a passive house with any build system. And as we've heard before, it's a personal choice, the build system really. Things like cost might come into the equation, maybe eco criteria, or perhaps it's skills in your area. You could argue in some respects, I suppose, things like ICF, which use concrete. It's inherently airtight. It's going to make that nice and easy. So you just need to worry about all the taping around the doors and windows. And then really you should have a very good performance and have achieved it very easily. My house, a masonry build, I always think of it like a big jigsaw, but it's a big jigsaw that works. And it's not as if Mark, our contractor, came and said, I can't do this. He just got on with it. Really, nothing is that difficult, but you've got more moving pieces. So I suppose you could say there's more scope for error, but you're also talking about what in the UK anyway, builders love to do, don't they? They just love masonry. So I think that one comes down to personal preference. The other thing to remember is that there are more and more solutions that are for passive house. And I'm a big fan of Jay Cottrell's PH15 system. I've just seen it a few times now. And I think that's really nice that the whole thing came about because of the need and the want, A, to have something ecological, but also to achieve passive house standards. So you've locked in quality straight away. And this is our final one here. When it comes to planning, how easy is it to adjust the orientation of a house? And the consensus here has to do with anything planning wise. It's really what's happening in your local area, what your local authority thinks about this. The good news is, on the whole, because I went to a local authority event a couple of weeks ago, was impressed that they really seem to like the idea of Passivhaus and want it to happen. But I think there were certain hurdles. It could even have been higher up in the chain of how things work. But I think they want to try and help you. And certainly when you're submitting plans and all the rest of it for bigger schemes, I don't see any reason. But when you're talking about one-off, sometimes everything has to line up in a grid. But I think they'll help you on the whole. So I will say a disclaimer at this point that this, although I was making notes as I went along at this workshop, I didn't think I was going to do a podcast about it then. It's only when I got home I thought, this is really good, these questions. And they are the sorts of questions. Of course, there'll be more. I don't think anyone asked about what hob do you have in a Passivhaus? I'm going to give you that as a bonus one today, because I do think more and more people go for induction hob, which is what we've got in our house. It's a lovely way to cook, very quick to boil water and things like that. Very easy to burn things, I'll say as well. But what do you do at that point with the extractor? That's the other question that people often ask. And I can only advise you what I've done in our case is that we have a recirculating fan. So it doesn't actually mess with the ventilation system. It almost just sucks all the air through a piece of charcoal, which you have to replace. That's one of the sad, maintenance thing that you've got to do, and then puts it back in the room. But it's supposedly taking out 90% or so of all the bad stuff and storing it in that piece, in that lump of charcoal. So there we go. Check out the show notes. I've made some notes for you. houseplanninghelp.com/271 for this episode. Have I missed anything? Were you there on the panel and have I misrepresented you? Please fix it all in the show notes. Comment away there. And yeah, that was good. Get along to that event as well. We'll obviously link you to the National Self-Build and Renovation Centre so you can head along next time. Just a quick iTunes review to throw in, and this comes from London ZW listener. Just discovered this podcast and have listened to a few episodes. All interesting, different and helpful. Thanks. That's it. It doesn't have to be a long review, but wherever you're listening, if you can write an iTunes review, massive help to us because it brings in newcomers and it spreads the word. And if you can describe at all what you're getting from the podcast, then that's even better. And finally, a quick hub update. We've got a new video in which covers the MVHR. This is in my own in-depth video case study. So this one's all about the MVHR system and how all the ducting's going through the house. It takes a look at the full ceiling. We've got our windows going in. We had a slight delay and you can find out why that delay happened. We need some bespoke fixings. So that's the latest video in the hub. In terms of live training, I don't think I've told you about these two. Juraj Mikurczyk, we heard that name before. He came on and gave us the lowdown of Old Holloway Passivhaus, including how he unearthed the plot. It wasn't one that was advertised. He went and found this himself, but it wasn't straightforward. There's a lot of negotiation with the landowner to get a design that they would support. And also planning itself, a few challenges there. Budget, he had to keep a really tight rein on budget. So really enjoyed that call. I think it's a really useful one in the archive if you're one of our members. Also, Wilf Mennel from Studio Bark. Great to have a chat with him again. And he's actually been on Grand Designs 3 times now. Firstly, for the Periscope House, which was the in-depth program. And that was actually very ecological, sourcing all the materials close to the site. And then the U-Build system, I think that was used by one of the couples on the street. And then one of his projects was featured recently on a Grand Designs episode, just one of the architecture firm's projects. And he gave us some of the background for that. And the lessons were fascinating. So definitely a couple of useful calls to check out. It's what we're trying to do, simplify the self-build journey, keep you learning, and also keep you learning in different ways, whether it's those calls where we can engage a bit more, or whether it's videos that are just interesting, focusing on details that other people perhaps might not do, just because my background is obviously with video and audio production, so it makes sense that I deliver the content in that way. So there we go. If you're not a Hub member, I don't know where you've been, but come and have a look, see what you're missing. houseplanninghelp.com/join. That's it for another day. Lovely to have your company. Thank you so much. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media. Content that matters.